I'm Dr. Brian Nickel, your cannabis expert for CannabisExpertMD.com. Today we're going to go over how you can make your own tinctures. Now, tinctures are an orally administered form of cannabinoids. Tinctures have a big advantage over the inhaled route of administration in that they're more potent and longer lasting and can provide much longer symptom control compared to the inhaled route of administration. They're also much more discreet to where patients can pretty much dose with them anytime you need to. Today we're going to be producing our MCT oil tincture from white whale flower. Now, white whale is a particular species of cannabis that is genetically incapable of making any other cannabinoid besides CBG. CBG is a cannabinoid that is usually found in very, very small quantities, if at all, in traditional cannabis products that are available at most dispensaries. Having access to a strain that makes 14.1% CBG, as the white whale does, now gives us access to CBG in sufficient quantities to really evaluate how well it works for certain conditions. In my patients, I have found the addition of CBG to other cannabinoids has been particularly useful for patients suffering from very bad inflammatory conditions such as multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus arthritis. In addition to being useful for the aforementioned inflammatory conditions, I've noticed that it has improved patients with generalized arthritic symptoms from osteoarthritis, and surprisingly it has been quite effective in my patients with anxiety disorders and bipolar disorders. Step one is to grind the cannabis up to expose as much of the surface area as possible for the decarboxylation and the infusion steps. I'm going to grind our samples of CBG flower using a dedicated grinder. It took roughly about 3 hours. Now it's time for us to add our MCT oil and do the infusion cycle with our tincture. Prior to being able to do this, of course, we have to figure out exactly how much MCT oil we're going to add for our infusion. In order to calculate the tincture concentrations, you have to answer 4 questions basically. First, how many milligrams is the total weight of your sample? How many milligrams of cannabinoids are in the sample? The retention rate of the tincture method, and we can use this to determine how much solvent to add. The first step is to determine the number of milligrams in your sample, and that's quite easy to do. You take the sample weight in grams, which we determined initially, and multiply by 1,000 milligrams per gram, and that gives you the total weight in grams. For our particular CBD flower that we're using, we had 25.49 grams times 1,000 milligrams per gram, means that we have a total of 25,490 milligrams total weight. The next question is, how many cannabinoids are in the sample? Well, that's relatively easy to determine also. You take the total number of milligrams in your sample and multiply it by the percent concentration present in the sample. When we look at the lab analysis for the CBG flower that we are using, the white whale, we will find that the CBGA is present at 14.122%. So the total CBG in our sample is equal to the total number of milligrams in the sample, which was 25,490 milligrams times 14.12%, which means the total CBG in our sample is going to be 3,594.1 milligrams. The next step is to determine the retention rate of the tincture method being used. Fortunately for the Nova FX, the company has come up with data that shows a 90% retention rate. So we take the total CBG in the sample, which is 3594.1 milligrams, multiply that by 0.9, meaning 90% retention, and the total CBD in our final sample is 3,234.7 milligrams. Now finally we come up with the big question, how much solvent to add? Well, in order to determine the total volume of tincture, you have to know the final sample milligrams, which we do know, and you divide that by the desired concentration in milligrams per milliliter. In this case, we are shooting for a 20 milligram per milliliter concentration of CBG tincture. So the total volume of tincture that should be present in the end is 34.7 milligrams divided by 20 milligrams per milliliter, which gives us a final volume of 161.73 milliliters. In this last slide on calculating tincture concentration shows our entire calculation for the white whale CBD tincture we're planning on making. With 25.49 grams total mass of the sample, we multiply that by 1,000 milligrams per gram to end up with our milligram weight of the final sample, which was 25,490 milligrams. The total CBG in the sample is equal to the weight of the sample, 25,490 milligrams, times 14.12%, which gives us a total CBG concentration of 3,594.1 milligrams. Assuming a 90% retention rate as Nova has demonstrated, that gives us a total CBG in our final sample of 3,234.7 milligrams. As we are looking for a desired concentration of 20 milligrams per milliliter, we divide that by 20 and come up with our final volume of tincture of 161.73 milliliters. We are going to be using a organic MCT oil. Now, MCT means medium chain triglyceride, and that almost always indicates organic coconut oil. In addition to the coconut oil we will be needing, you can also will find graduated cylinders for accurate measurements of the volumes very useful. With a final volume of 161.73 milliliters, we're going to get approximately that on our initial infusion step, as you always do lose a little bit of tincture, so I'm going to be shooting for right around 165-170 milliliters of organic MCT. That is 100 milliliter volume there. And a roughly 70 milliliter volume here. You add it to your decarboxylated cannabis. Give it a little stir. I use a glass rod that came with my graduated cylinder sets. Place the cover on the machine, and once again hit the activation button. We are again going to change this machine to the infusion setting by pressing the M button. Infusion uses a lower temperature than decarboxylation does. And press the button at the top here to start the infusion cycle. The light turns red. When the light goes green, our tincture is ready to be filtered. With the infusion cycle complete, now the infusion cycle uses a lower temperature to infuse the cannabinoids into the oil. It's now complete after several hours' time. Next step is filtration. I usually do a two-step filtration. Initial, a coarse one to sort out most of the plant material, and then a finer filtration with a coffee filter to sort out the finer silt. And gravity takes care of the rest for us. We'll return to this shortly after the initial filtration, do a final filtration, and then determine our final dilution to the desired volume to obtain 20 milligrams per milliliter of CBG. First, or the coffee filter I should say, just makes filtration go a little bit easier, and it could possibly preserve some of the cannabinoids. Quite simply then, we take our initial filtration mix, run it through the coffee filter to remove the little bit of particulate sludge that you see in the end, as we probably have lost a bit of volume with our initial extraction. I'm just going to do a little bit of a rinse to pick up the last little bit of material from here. And once again, we let gravity do the work for us. As it is kind of sunny at this point in time and ultraviolet light does damage cannabinoids, I'm going to cover this while it filters. Our second filtration completed, you can see in the coffee filter the residual fine matter that was filtered out. We've got our almost final tincture, but at this point we need to measure the volume of tincture present and dilute it up to our pre-calculated volume of 161.73 milliliters, essentially 160 milliliters for our purposes, to achieve a 20 milligram per milliliter concentration. I use a graduated cylinder to measure the volume as precisely as possible. So we take the amount of tincture that we have, and we're expecting more than 100 milliliters, which is what this particular cylinder's upper limit of normal is. And at this point we have 100 milliliters of tincture. I'm going to empty that in a second cup. Okay, at this point, if you can read on the line, we've got slightly less than 30 milliliters here, so we're we're considerably less than our 161 milliliter total we're aiming for. So we need to dilute this up to 160, 1.73 milliliters, 160 for our purposes. I'm going to do a wash of the residual tincture out of the last one here as I dilute up so we don't lose any of the cannabinoids we've gone to all the trouble to extract. And we are right at 161 milliliters. I'm going to add that to our prior tincture. All this requires at this point of time is a very good mixing, and it will be ready to bottle. A little back and forth and a stir, and we'll be ready to measure out and bottle, which will be our final step. The final step now is bottling our tincture. As I mentioned, ultraviolet light does damage cannabinoids. It's imperative you use a glass bottle that is going to block ultraviolet light. That would include bottles that are blue, black, totally opaque, or amber. In this case, I'm using cobalt blue bottles. I use a second graduated cylinder in which I've measured out 17 milliliters. These are 15 milliliter bottles and they hold 17 just fine. From the larger cylinder, the bottle is filled, capped with the dropper. Now that our tincture is complete, the all-important phase of labeling has to be completed. It is very important you label your tinctures. All these bottles look the same, and if you're making multiple tinctures, it's very easy to confuse one with another, and you do not want to confuse your medications. All your label information should include the name of the strain, the particular carrier oil, in this case it was MCT. If it's ethanol, you need to list that, the calculated percentage of cannabinoid, as well as the date of manufacture. That's going to be important for you as far as keeping track of the age of the tinctures. MCT oil tinctures are useful for approximately a 12-month period of time. These tinctures are ready to go and ready to be used right now. Do-it-yourself tinctures can be a very, very cost-effective way at treating your symptoms with cannabinoids. I hope you found this somewhat informative and have perhaps been encouraged to pursue this yourself. We're going to provide some further information on some other do-it-yourself tinctures in future episodes of this. Thanks so much for tuning in to Cannabis Expert MD for this do-it-yourself tincture episode. I do hope you tune into Cannabis Expert MD for information on all things medical cannabis.